In today's video, we're going to take a look at the top rated WCW pay-per-views. There's a lot of negativity around WCW, and for good reason too. From all the bad matches they put on, all the bad decisions they made from a creative aspect, all those pay-per-views they put on towards the end that made fans feel like they just got ripped off. WCW made an incredible amount of mistakes, and it's always interesting looking back at those mistakes while trying to figure out exactly why they did the things they did. So today I wanted to put WCW in a more positive light. I'm still a huge fan of WCW, and there's a lot of gold to be found within their extensive video library. So let's take a look at the highest rated WCW pay-per-views as voted by viewers over on cagematch.net. Again, I know Cage Match has been a bit of a joke recently with modern WWE and AEW fans review bombing matches and shows, but the WCW stuff has been relatively safe, and the top 10 we've got here isn't bad at all. Personally, I would make a few changes, but I'll add a couple of extra recommendations at the end of the video. At number 10, we've got Beach Blast 92, taking place on the 20th of June in Mobile, Alabama. 1992 seen as a bad year for WCW, but Beach Blast does a fantastic job of highlighting how varied their roster really was. Sting, Cactus Jack, Steve Austin, the Steiner Brothers, Flyin Brian, Rick Rude. One could easily argue that the 1992 WCW roster was better than the WWF's ensemble of over-the-top superstars, but that's maybe a discussion for another day. Sting took on Cactus Jack here in a fantastic Falls Count Anywhere match. Hardcore matches were not very prevalent during this era, especially on WCW programming, and while the action here is rather timid in comparison to what we'd see a few years later, this is still a pretty physical and hard-hitting match. You've also got a pretty great Ricky Steamboat vs Rick Rude 30-minute Iron Man match that's absolutely jam-packed with pinfalls, a Dangerous Alliance 6-man tag where the boys go up against Barry Windham, Nikita Koloff and Dustin Rhodes. I wasn't a big fan of the finish here though, with Arn getting disqualified for jumping off the top rope, and I always thought putting the Steiners vs Steve Williams and Terry Gordy tag team bout at the end of the card was a bit weird, but it's still a good match. Yeah, a pretty good pay-per-view during a bad time for WCW, one you can watch from start to end without getting bored. Next, we've got the 1996 Great American Bash, taking place on the 16th of June in Baltimore, Maryland. Not sure if I entirely agree with this one because there are a few stinkers here, mainly John Tenta vs Big Bubba, the Lex Luger vs Giant main event, and a tag team match where Kevin Green and Steve McMichael took on Ric Flair and Arn Anderson. Admittedly, it is fun seeing the crowd react to Kevin Green, and his enthusiasm for pro wrestling was definitely one of the best things about his WCW performances, but the action in the ring wasn't the best, to be honest. In saying that, Great American Bash 96 has two very good matches. Rey Mysterio and Dean Malenko had an 18-minute show stealer, which was also the longest match on the card, and Chris Benoit took on Kevin Sullivan in a very physical Falls Count Anywhere match that went all around the arena. Malenko vs Mysterio was fantastic. You know what they expect from these two, and the fact that they were given so much ring time shows us that WCW knew how good they were too. As time went on, the cruiserweights would get less and less ring time, but 96 and 97 were definitely the best years for the high flyers of World Championship Wrestling. Benoit and Sullivan had a series of hard-hitting matches, and this one's no exception. I know there's much more interest in the personal backstory between these two, but when they went to war in WCW, they always beat the hell out of each other. They also had a thing for fighting in restrooms, and they make sure to visit said location in this match. Also, this is the pay-per-view where Eric Bischoff takes a jackknife from Kevin Nash. The Outsiders had only arrived in WCW, and it was here where the Bash at the Beach Hostile Takeover match was made official. SuperBrawl 2 was another good WCW pay-per-view that took place during bad times in the company. This one comes from Milwaukee, Wisconsin on the 29th of February 1992, and the opening match was an all-timer, Flyin Brian Pillman vs Jushin Liger for the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship. Brian won the match after around 17 minutes of action, and this one definitely fits into my top 10 WCW matches of all time. I'm not sure exactly where, but it really was that good. The Dangerous Alliance also had back-to-back tag team matches at this show, and both were pretty good. The first featured Steve Austin and Larry Zbyszko taking on Barry Windham and Dustin Rhodes, and the second featured Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton taking on the Steiner brothers. Both of these matches are around the 20-minute mark, so if you enjoy tag team wrestling, then you're going to enjoy these bouts. Both matches are pretty solid. Rick Rude defends his US title against Ricky Steamboat, Ron Simmons takes on Cactus Jack, and Lex Luger says goodbye to WCW after dropping the world title to Sting in the main event. The total package would show up soon afterwards in WWF, but he would make his WCW return on the first ever episode of Nitro. SuperBrawl 2 is all about what happens in the ring, and I do agree that it belongs in today's video of the best WCW pay-per-views of all time. Ranking in at number 7, it's Starrcade 1988, the first of 2 Starrcade shows in this top 10. Taking place in Norfolk, Virginia on the 26th of December, this one happened shortly after Ted Turner bought Jim Crockett Promotions. The main event features Lex Luger challenging Ric Flair for the NWA Championship. Lex was brought into JCP as a member of the Four Horsemen, but after leaving the group and having a brief feud with friend turned foe Barry Windham, the total package finally got his opportunity to face Slick Rick at the NWA's biggest show of the year. Luger wasn't able to overcome the Nature Boy, but it's still a good match. This is some prime Ric Flair right here, and he made Luger look like $1,000,000 even though Lex was still trying to work things out in regards to his in-ring abilities. It's another event filled to the brim with tag team matches. Sting and Dusty Rhodes take on the Road Warriors. The Midnight Express, consisting of Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane, take on the original Midnight Express featuring Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose. You've got the Varsity Club versus the Fantastics in the pay-per-view opener. And the only other singles matches we have on this card features Mike Rotunda taking on Rick Steiner and a Barry Windham versus Bam Bam Bigelow match. Personally speaking, it's not one of my favourite pay-per-views, but I do enjoy the main event for what it is. Though again, if you enjoy tag team wrestling, then this is one to check out. Still one of the better Starrcade pay-per-views of the late 80s. Halloween Havoc 93 from New Orleans, Louisiana not only features an incredibly cheesy intro that has Tony Schiavone turn into a giant creepy monster, but it also features an excellent spin the wheel make the deal match in the main event. Vader tried his luck and he selected a Texas death match for the main event against Cactus Jack. And this one has to rank up there as one of the most violent matches in WCW pay-per-view history. Mentally, Mick Foley wasn't in a great place when this event took place and he was seriously considering retiring for good. He took an insane back bump on the rampway here and he thought it was maybe time to cash in his insurance policy and walk away from pro wrestling forever. Thankfully, Mick stuck around to give fans more crazy moments, but if things turned out differently, this could have been his very last match. Mick wasn't able to beat Big Van Vader at Halloween Havoc 93, but it's still a gripping match filled to the brim with stiff shots and hard bumps. One of those matches you simply need to see for yourself. Lord Steven Regal and Davey Boy Smith have a match that really takes you by surprise. It goes to a 15-minute time limit draw, but it's got some great technical mat wrestling from bell to bell. Davey shows off some great counter wrestling here that he never really got to show all that much during his time in WWF, and you can really tell that Regal and Davey enjoyed working with each other. It's a fantastic match that deserves more recognition. Steve Austin challenges Dustin Rhodes for the US Championship, and it's another match that's quite surprising. No doubt both men could go, but their styles meshed really well here, and it's the best match these two ever had against each other, in my opinion. What else? Oh yeah, there's a Sting versus Sid Vicious match, but I thought it was just okay. Rick Rude versus Ric Flair's a decent 20-minute showdown that unfortunately ended via disqualification. And you've got Paul Orndorff taking on Ricky Steamboat in a match that was also pretty good. I always underrate Orndorff for some reason, and he showed here that he could still go at a decent level in 1993. Halloween Havoc 93 is one of the better Halloween Havoc shows WCW ever produced. It's a good balance of matches and there's something here for everyone. I just kinda wish the Sting vs Sid Vicious match was a little bit better. At number 5, it's Starrcade 96, taking place in Nashville, Tennessee on December 29th. I covered this one for Reliving the War a few years ago, and I said in that video that there really isn't a bad match on this card. The only real complaint I had was the second half of Starrcade was a bit NWO heavy, and the show would have benefited from having a different match order, but I also complimented the show by saying Starrcade 96 was probably the last good Starrcade WCW ever produced before things started going downhill. You go into the Roddy Piper vs Hulk Hogan bout thinking it's going to be a typical below average WCW main event, but it's actually not all that bad. Yes, the end was a bit weird, seeing as Piper beat the world champion without actually winning the championship, but the crowd were very much into the match, and this is long before WCW ran the Hogan vs Piper rivalry into the ground. 96 and 97 were also the years of incredible WCW opening matches, and Starrcade 96 is no different. Ultimo Dragon put the J Crown up for grabs against Dean Malenko's Cruiserweight Championship, and after a spectacular showcase bout, Dragon was able to add the Cruiserweight title to his growing collection of gold belts. Akira Hokuto took on Medusa to crown the inaugural WCW Women's Champion, a title that was unfortunately retired soon after it debuted. You've got Jushin Liger vs Rey Mysterio in the first and only singles match these two ever had against each other. Jeff Jarrett took on Chris Benoit in a match that exceeded expectations. And then the second half of the show's all pretty much NWO, even in matches where they don't really need to get involved. Still, the Outsiders vs the Faces of Fear was one of the better matches Hall and Nash had on pay-per-view, and as mentioned earlier, you might be pleasantly surprised by the Hogan vs Piper match. I know folks don't like to admit it these days, but back then the crowd was on fire for this main event. This Starrcade does a good job of capturing what WCW was all about back then. The NWO stuff may have been a little overdone, but that's what people were tuning in to see. This, along with a brilliant selection of undercard matches, makes Starrcade 96 a great primer for those wanting to experience WCW before things got really chaotic. SuperBrawl 3 took place in Nashville, North Carolina on the 21st of February. It has one terrible match, that being Dustin Rhodes defending his US title against Max Payne. Yeah, Max Payne. But WCW makes up for it with a ton of great matches on this card, including Too Cold Scorpio vs Chris Benoit, the Rock and Roll Express vs the Heavenly Bodies, and the infamous White Castle of Fear strap match pitting Big Van Vader against Sting. Scorpio vs Benoit shows us how good Scorpio really was, and as time goes by, he's definitely starting to fall into the underrated category. The guy was a phenomenal performer at his peak, and he has a good opponent here to show off what he can do. New wrestling fans can also get a glimpse of what made the Rock and Roll Express so good in their match against Stan Lane and Tom Pritchard. Yes, the Rock and Roll may have been slightly past their prime here, but you get to see all the little things that made them such a well-revered tag team, and hey, their opponents aren't half bad either. The match of the night for me, though, is the main event. Vader and Sting beat the absolute hell out of each other in another violent and hard-hitting match. It's not for the squeamish, and I'm sure a few little Stingers were incredibly worried for their hero's well-being. But even in defeat, Sting showed how tough he was by going toe-to-toe with Vader in such a brutal match. A match I wasn't too fond of though was the NWA Championship bout pitting champion Great Muta versus Barry Windham. On paper this sounds like a fantastic showdown, but these two did not mesh well at all and the match went way too long. Still pretty cool seeing Windham finally win the NWA Championship though. After the bout, Ric Flair tried to present the belt to the new NWA champion, but Barry walked away. This would lead to Windham declining an invite to join the Horsemen once again, and he would eventually drop the championship to Flair at Beach Blast 93. At number 3, it's the iconic 1996 Bash at the Beach show from Daytona Beach, taking place on July 7th. This landmark event changed everything. It wasn't only WCW who completely changed direction when this pay-per-view went off the air, but eventually the WWF had to change their whole style of broadcast television thanks to the events that happened at this very show. Sting, Lex Luger and Randy Savage were handpicked by WCW to face two company outsiders and their mystery partner. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall made headlines when they jumped over to WCW, but the way they were presented was the key ingredient. These weren't two guys who just signed new contracts to begin working World Championship Wrestling. These were two guys who wanted to take over the company while being presented as invaders. Razor Ramon and Diesel were big players in WWF. They laughed at the idea of WCW being the home to where the big boys play, and at Bash at the Beach they were going to reveal who their mystery partner was. By the sounds of things, this third guy would share the same ideals as Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, so fans were tuning in to see who else jumped ship or who maybe turned on WCW. In the end, it was Hulk Hogan, and Hogan's heel turn is widely considered as the best and most influential heel turn of all time. Hogan hits his old friend Macho with a few leg drops, he grabs a microphone to say he built pro wrestling while WCW fans didn't show him any respect. The New World Order was officially born and WCW was never the same again. The formation of the NWO is one of WCW's biggest triumphs. It made people want to watch pro wrestling again. And even though the whole thing got played out and it all became very messy, the formation of the group is still one of the greatest moments in pro wrestling history. Look elsewhere on this card and you will find some good matches. Rey Mysterio Jr. and Psychosis have a good opening bout. Dean Malenko vs Disco Inferno isn't bad either, although I do think people overrate it a little. And Ric Flair vs Conan sounds like a mismatch, but it's actually alright. Everything gets overshadowed by Hulk Hogan's heel turn though, and that's not a bad thing. A legendary moment in pro wrestling history right here. At number 2, it's Fall Brawl 96, taking place on September 15th in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This one happened 2 months after the NWO formed at Bash at the Beach, and now Hollywood Hogan was the WCW Heavyweight Champion. The NWO were going to step into War Games to take on WCW's finest in the ultimate battle between good and evil, but there was a big question mark over one of the guys representing WCW, the man called Sting. The NWO used a fake Sting to fool everyone. Even Sting's partners didn't believe the icon when he said he wasn't part of the group, and this lack of trust between the babyfaces of WCW was what ultimately led to their downfall. The real Sting confronted the fake Sting in the middle of the main event War Games match, and after proving to everyone that he was innocent, Sting decided to walk out on his partners and the NWO won the match. The events that took place inside War Games would give birth to the Crow Sting, and WCW would have to work hard to regain Sting's trust. Elsewhere on the card, Chris Jericho and Chris Benoit have a fantastic 15-minute showdown that ends with Benoit getting the win. Immediately after this, Rey Mysterio defended his cruiserweight belt against one of WCW's most underrated cruiserweight contenders, Super Calo, and there's also a submission match that saw Ice Train defeating Scott Norton. This match got ranked pretty low, but I thought it was alright. It's exactly what you'd expect it to be, and that's okay. Conan vs Juventud Guerrera wasn't half bad either, but I will admit to not enjoying the Randy Savage vs Giant match all that much. A good show here though, with a great NWO vs WCW main event. It's these early days of the NWO that I'm fond of, and it really did feel like World Championship Wrestling was unstoppable during this era. It was miles better than what the WWF was producing during this time period. The number 1 WCW pay-per-view, as voted by the folks who frequent CageMatch.net, is Spring Stampede 94, taking place in Rosemont, Illinois on the 17th of April. A few years after their legendary match trilogy, Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair hooked it up once again. They went for over half an hour here and they tore the house down. Granted, it wasn't as good as their older showdowns, but come on, the bar was set way too high. It's still a fantastic match here though, and the finish leaves a lot of questions. It ends with a double pin, so we don't really find out who's the better man, but I think the finish actually suited the match and the story they had going into it. Elsewhere on the card, we have got a meeting between the great Muta and Steve Austin. The match isn't great, but it's still pretty awesome that these two wrestled each other. There's a messy brawl for the tag team championships, the Nasty Boys versus Cactus Jack and Max Payne. You'll see a few decent spots in this match, and it's maybe the best bout Max Payne ever had. And if you do enjoy a good brawl, then you'll also want to check out Bunkhouse Buck versus Dustin Rhodes. Yeah, Buck may have had zero charisma, but this Bunkhouse match is actually way better than you'd expect. Vader vs Bossman, or Vader vs the Boss, is another hard-hitting affair as you'd expect from these two, but it's not all brawls and hoss matches. For example, Lord Steven Regal vs Flyin Brian's a great blend of high flying and technical wrestling that again goes to a time limit draw. Yeah, these were frequent in TV title matches, but still what you get here is very good. Sting defeated Rick Rude at this show for the WCW International Championship, and opinions seem to be mixed on this one. I do agree that it's a little bit uneventful, but if you're a fan of both of these guys like I am, then you'll still enjoy it. Really, it's all about Flair versus Steamboat though. This is the match you'll want to check out. It just so happens that the main event's well complemented by other matches on the card, and that's what makes it WCW's highest rated show. So, what are we missing here? Well, the big omission for me was Wrestle War 1992. This one features what many consider to be the best War Games match of all time, but admittedly there are a few matches that missed the mark on this card. Ron Simmons vs Mr. Hughes was absolute toilet break material. Super Invader vs Todd Champion shouldn't have been given 5 seconds, let alone 5 minutes. Ricky Morton vs Big Josh makes you wonder what these guys were smoking when putting this card together, so you can probably see why it didn't rank so highly. Still though, I feel the War Games match totally makes up for it. A guilty pleasure WCW pay-per-view for me is Slamboree 97. I don't think this even made it into the top 50 WCW pay-per-views on Cage Match, but the way the crowd reacts to the main event is really something else. It's Kevin Nash, Scott Hall in 6 taking on Ric Flair, Roddy Piper and Kevin Green. And it's just a really fun main event where you can tell the competitors are just enjoying themselves. Seriously, watch it back and check out the main event, you'll see exactly what I mean. Also, the Steve Regal vs Ultimo Dragon opening match is very good. 15 minutes of action here, and it sets the crowd up nicely for the rest of the card. SuperBrawl 7, I feel, has a fantastic undercard with matches such as Eddie Guerrero vs Chris Jericho, and a great 6-man tag featuring Viano 4, La Parka and Conan taking on Ciclope, Juventud Guerrera and Super Calo. Prince Ikea vs Rey Mysterio wasn't terrible either, and I also enjoyed the WCW Tag Team title match featuring Lex Luger and the Giant taking on Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. This event got seriously dragged down though by the main event, another Hulk Hogan vs Roddy Piper match, and I do think the main event hurt the overall perception of the whole pay-per-view. Starrcade 93 is another event I would have considered here. It features a very emotional match between Ric Flair and Big Van Vader where Flair said he'd retire if he didn't win the world belt. The crowd reaction to Flair winning was absolutely phenomenal, and it ranks up there as one of WCW's greatest ever moments. Again though, the undercard's the problem here. The Shockmaster vs King Kong, Pretty Wonderful vs Too Cold Scorpio and Marcus Bagwell, a Rick Rude vs Bossman match that really failed to excite the audience. Yeah, you can see why others wouldn't like this show. There's Halloween Havoc 97, Spring Stampede 99, Bash at the Beach 94. Yeah, you know, the thing is, when it comes to WCW pay-per-views, for every moment of magic and for every big 5-star match, there's always other stuff you have to get through, and a lot of that stuff can range from okay to downright terrible. Consistency wasn't all that big in World Championship Wrestling, unfortunately. Still, I hope this video gave you some recommendations, and hopefully some of you new pro wrestling fans will notice that WCW wasn't all that bad. It was actually pretty great sometimes, and you're definitely missing out if you're not digging into their video library. Thank you so much for watching, and please take care.